Hello, my History 157 students. This is Professor Donald Earl Collins. It is week 2 of this course of U.S. history from 1865 to the present. Just have a few things to say about week 2, about your assignments and other things from week 1, and the upcoming topic proposal for week 2. And that's pretty much it. So, first of all, so far so good. Week 1 was mostly very solid. In a lot of cases, actually very good for students in terms of both getting your work done, getting it done on time, and having discussion. I think the main thing there are quite a few main things, right? But the main thing is do your stuff on time if you can, and if you can't, just get an extension. Don't be late because the based on the rubric, I actually have to take some points off if you are late. I generally try not to, especially since the pandemic started. But there actually is a category there where timeliness kind of matters. So please keep that in mind. If you did not, you still have a full week to correct stuff. You can correct stuff for week 1 until the end of week 2 until the end of week 3, and so on and so forth. So you have an extra week built in there so that you can correct stuff. So if you haven't submitted all of your responses to your classmates, or only 1 out of 2, please do that. If you haven't submitted anything at all, I think that's a couple of you, please do that. Otherwise, the 0 that you already have on your grade will remain a 0. So there's that. But in terms of substantively, mostly please. About half of you didn't really do much with the part of the question on the amendments about the impact those amendments had on African Americans, or you decided that there was no impact. Yes, those amendments were weak. Any amendment that is not enforced by the force of law that comes with it, whether it's through the military or through actually taking people to the court, imprisoning them, taking away their freedom for taking away other people's freedoms, it's going to be weak, right? And the 13th Amendment already has a clause built into it whereby if you are imprisoned specifically for a felony, that you can be worked as if you are a slave, not paid to do back-breaking work, and in the process of that, you've got, you know, 3 hots in a cot, basically, is the slang term goes for describing what it's like to be in jail. And that's as close to slavery as you're going to get. It's still not slavery, chattel slavery in the absolute sense of the word, meaning that you are going to create more slaves with that group of slaves that ex-slaves that you turned into slave-esque people by being in prison, by impregnating them and making their kids slaves too. It's still not the same, right? Even that isn't the same, and that's kind of one of the points I want to make too about some of your responses, and some of your posts. There is nothing like the slavery of the Western Hemisphere. Nothing. Not Roman slavery, not Mongols capturing people and raping them and pillaging them, not any other group, because it was fully generational. It relied on ownership of the wombs of black women, meaning that if a black woman had a kid, they were automatically codified by law as slaves, right? Property, right? Property to the point where a lot of those slaves were basically the progeny of enslaved African/black women who were being raped by their slave owners, or their slave owners' overseers, or their slave owner's brother, or the son of a slave owner, and so on and so forth. That's how you have so many slaves in the United States compared to every other country in the Western Hemisphere. That's what makes slavery in the U.S. unique to any other slavery, even among chattel slavery in the Western Hemisphere, that you produce generational slavery for a quarter of a millennia out of all of that. And so when you say it's sharecropping is like slavery, it's not. So when you say wage labor, because we're going to be dealing with some of that for the next couple of weeks with regard to the Gilded Age, big business, urbanization, immigration, all those other things. It's not slavery. I mean, I don't want to hear about the Irish and indentured servitude. I don't want to hear about white ethnics working in Pittsburgh and steel mills and being told that that's like slavery. None of it's slavery. Did I say it was? I didn't say it wasn't brutal. I didn't say that people were being treated unfair. I didn't say that there were severe inequities there. Obviously, there are, but it's still not chattel slavery like that. And so, every time you do that, you basically dehumanize and demeans the people who had to be these slaves themselves, who had to be enslaved. You're erasing them. You're marginalizing them in ways that quite frankly, we as a country have always marginalized these people. So put that aside. In a way that, quite frankly, um, the the post on indigenous peoples in the United States, what happened to them during Western expansion, were much more careful in terms of understanding that these people basically went through genocide. There's no way to describe it as other than that. It's genocide. And the few folks who did this question, this prompt, actually addressed it with the proper sense of even-handedness that it deserved. So there's that. Um, so the amendments aren't nothing, and what African Americans did with those amendments, reacted to them, how I've helped them in some respects. There's not much in the readings on it, but there's still some stuff. A number of you were able to pull up them moving, finding other places to live, finding families, starting families. Um, you know, Black men exercising the right to vote for a few years before Jim Crow fully took hold in the South in the late 1870s and then 1880s. Some becoming politicians themselves and holding office, right? At federal level, at the state level, even at local levels, right? Things like that. Um, Engaging new arrangements for access to land and farming to take care of their families, because so many of them were basically left without any resources, because of course if you're freed person, you probably didn't have that many resources to begin with. I mean, it's not like these folks were trying to build up wealth while they were enslaved, right? So there's all of that. So thank you for trying to deal with those questions as best you can. You did a good job overall. I'm just pointing out some of the things that folks didn't get right. So, unfortunately, the way this course is set up, we move on from these pressing issues. Even though they're still there, we're moving on from these pressing issues to other aspects of American history, right? And so there's that. On the quiz, the last thing I'll talk about is regarding for week one is the quiz. In the quiz, most of you got 100. About 4 of you who did it. And all 4 of you at some point, or 3 out of 4 of you, sent me emails basically complaining that there's something wrong with X question, something wrong with Y question. And as I've said before, I have very little control over many of the components of this course. That includes those um, AI-generated quizzes that are developed by faculty, not yours truly, but by other faculty in the department, and by collegiate faculty, which I am not. And so as a result, I don't have an answer key, and I don't know what all the questions say. All I can do is set up the course in the best way that I see fit. I have very little control over many components, but discussions is one, and certainly the timing of when you submit your initial post is one. So if I put down Sunday, but the standard at UMGC is Saturday, then probably your best bet is to pick Saturday, which most of you did. So that's good. In terms of, so for those of you who did it, I basically gave you a 2.5 point curve because there were 50 points. These 2.5 points is basically half a letter grade at this point for a 50-point quiz. So grade got bumped up a little bit. You gained 5 percentage points as a result for that question or for any other question that you might have thought there was a discrepancy for. So for those of you who have 100, you still have 100. I'm not changing your grade to 105. This is in high school. But for those of you whose grade was less than 100, I essentially assigned you an extra 2.5 points, 5% bump in your total grade for that. So just make sure you understand that what I'm asking for, right? That what I'm asking for might be a little bit more nuanced and different than what's in the quiz, but for the most part, everything's the same. So there's that. Okay, week two. Week two is about what I call the shuns. Um, and I do it that way because thematically, the way we set up U.S. history pre 1865 of post 1865 act as if there's no industrial. We talk about the industrialization for a couple of weeks, in the early 19th century. Then we forget about it as if it stopped, right? Until the Civil War, and then the Civil War period was like, oh, we have all these factories, we can make all this stuff, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, obviously, people were making all that stuff in the 1810s and 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s before the arrival of the Civil War. Then you just start building factories then. But what happened in the period during the Civil War was the South was trying to fight to preserve slavery as an institution for economic development and for, quite frankly, for white men to get rich off of. Um, Despite the fact that millions of white men didn't get rich off it, was their American dream. I wrote an article precisely on that last year. So, with details, from Thomas Jefferson on about how this was the first American dream. So, I don't think it's much of a debate, but anyway. But first American dream for them and for, quite frankly, a lot of white folks who lived up north. A lot of them came south for that dream. And so the second industrial revolution is actually the fulfillment of the American dream, the rags to riches kinds of things. The Horatio Alger stories of people who arrive, in the states with 35 cents or $35 to their name, and they end up becoming, you know, multimillionaires, really multi-billionaires by if you were to inflate their numbers and turn it into 2022 dollars, right? The dollars of the year 2022, right? To use an example, uh, Andrew Carnegie was worth roughly about $1 billion, $1.1 billion in 1900 or 1919 dollars. That would make him worth about $500 billion today. Do you understand how much inflation's increased since like the turn of the 20th century? So that's what we're talking about here in terms of individuals and big businesses and so on and so forth. But this is all part of the second industrial revolution and part of what I could consider larger processes called the shuns, the TIONs, right? All these big, gigantic processes that help gradually change American history, U.S. history, world history in some cases, are basically they're shuns, right? So urbanization can be the building of new cities, right? It can be, right? But cities don't urbanize. I don't want to see that in your posts, and I don't want to see that in your responses to each other this week. Cities do not urbanize. Cities can get bigger. Cities can incorporate small towns. They can incorporate farmland and make their cities bigger. But cities don't urbanize. People do, right? Urbanization is the process of people moving to cities as cities expand to accommodate them. Sometimes their distance between the time the person arrives, the time cities expand, is not one to one, but that's basically it's about people becoming urban, about people from farms moving to cities so they can work in factories. So that's how industrialization, urbanization combined with, say, migration if it's within the same country, or immigration if someone's coming from another country to live in our country in order to work in a factory and so on and so forth. So in this week, we're really talking about three things in terms of the shuns. You're talking about industrialization, in this case, the second industrial revolution of heavy industry. You're talking about urbanization, the movement of large groups of people to cities. Um, some cases from within the United States, in most cases from outside the U.S. And three, excuse me, their urbanization, those people, and they're finding their way to live in these cities, and that's really more week three than week two with the Gilded Age and progressive era trying to do progressivism in an era where people are dying from typhoid and dysentery and other diseases based, quite frankly, on fecal matter or shit, right? Because you don't have adequate plumbing and adequate, sanitation facilities for people to, take a dump, and keep, the germs that come from E. coli and all those other things from reaching their lungs, their other body parts, and killing them, right? Those kinds of things, and how do you deal with that? Progressivism is a part of that, but that's more week 3 than week 2. So the textbook would have you believe that, for the most part, you know, America is a great country, and that, this second industrial revolution of heavy industry, of, mining for iron ore and coal, and to turn coal into coke, and to turn iron ore into steel, and building steel mills, and I said steel mills because I lived in Pittsburgh for 12 years, so there's that. Or building so that you can build railroads from one part of the country to the other. And you wouldn't have been able to do that without being able to make steel very cheaply, right? Those kinds of things, right? Mining, meat packing, steel, eventually the use of oil by the turn of the 20th century with J.D. Rockefeller and his, multi-billionaire butt, and all kinds of other things. So this is about America, the business of America being about business, the business of American government being about business, and American government mostly turning a blind eye to all of the ridiculously horrific practices that they engaged in, and that these companies engaged in order to hire people, to make them work for 12 hours a day for 8 to 10 cents an hour, for 6 days a week, where they only might have gotten Sunday or half of a Sunday off. Um, this is an age where the average life expectancy for people is 46 years old. That doesn't mean that most people only live till 46. It means that, with infant mortality rates being approximately one out of every, one or two out of every, say, 9 live births, right? Most kids didn't make it to, about 1 out of every 4 kids didn't make it to 5. About 1 in 10 kids didn't make it to the age of 11 when your immune system's fully developed, or developed enough to, fend off stuff. That's what we're talking about here. The living conditions in these cities, in these tenements in places like New York and Pittsburgh and Boston and Philadelphia, were quite frankly horrific. Um, if you wanted to compare it to what the living quarters of slaves might have been like, there's some comparison, to be sure. They still had stoves to warm themselves up, though. So there's that. So that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about the nexus of these big forces. So I'll keep things brief because it will take me forever to go through all of these forces, right? Usually when I teach this class for a 3-hour session, I spend probably almost 45 minutes on these so that you fully understand these processes. So I'll do it in 3. So basically, you got the Industrial Revolution, and you need people to work these jobs, these horrific jobs. But since the U.S. is still primarily rural, primarily agrarian, most people aren't just going to jump and run to these places. You got to hire, and let's be honest, it's you care about profit, you're going to try to maximize your profitability. So getting rural white folk to move to cities wasn't going to happen. Not in 1870. Maybe by the turn of the 20th century, but not in 1870, because that's a trickle process. And so your next bet is probably ex-slaves, freedmen, freedwomen, that kind of thing. But, by the time they think about bringing that group, there's already groups of folks coming who are really cheap, who are white ethnics, non-WASP Americans, non-white Anglo-Saxon Protestants from England and Scotland and Wales and France and, Protestant parts of what's now Germany and, Scandinavia and the Low Countries of the Netherlands, the Belgium, and Luxembourg. These folks are from Southern Eastern Europe. They're Italiano, they're Polish, they're Polish and Russian Jews, German Jews, there are German Catholics in some cases. The Irish certainly have been coming for about 2 generations at this point, by the time you get to the 1870s. Um, Greeks, Slovaks, Serbs, all those groups, what do they all have in common? Most of these people are dirt poor. They are basically making it hand to mouth, living in the poorest rural districts in poorest rural communities across southern Eastern Europe, where it's Sicily for Italians, or whether it's part of Piedmont country for northern Italians, and so on and so forth. Um, they also don't speak English. They're also mostly Catholic. And as such, given the racism in the United States at this point, they're treated as if they're white, but I mean they're Caucasian, but they're not white, and they're treated as such. There's a lot of anti-immigrant feeling in the U.S. in this period. They are the folks that people are telling to get out in the late 19th and early 20th century. And 33 million of them come to this country basically between 1870 and World War One. So over a 45-year period, 33 million come, 26 million stay, and they mostly live in cities. Mostly work in mining, in factories. Um, if they do have local businesses, there are concerns within their own ethnic enclaves, not for everyone else to frequent. Um, and it changes the composition, quite frankly, of white people in the United States. Even though they're not accepted by WASPs for quite some time. The Irish take until the big second decade of the 20th century to be accepted. Same thing with Poles. Italians really take until the 1960s to be accepted as white. I'm serious about this. Look up your stuff around The Godfather. There's a series called The Offer, I believe, on Paramount Plus, which talks about some of that in the series. Yeah. So, all the folks that we call white in the United States today weren't always white. Jews certainly weren't. In a lot of cases, there are a lot of people who don't think Jews are white. So that's all part of the process of the rise of big business. Larger cities like Chicago exploding in population, New York growing from a city of about 500,000 people to basically 5 million people within a span of 30 years. Chicago growing from 300,000 people at the time of the Chicago fire in 1871 to over 3 million people by 1910. And we could go on and on. I could go through every city like this. But the bottom line is the nexus of the Second Industrial Revolution, this massive amount of immigration to the United States, where 5 out of every 6 immigrants stay, right, and stay in cities and grow these cities, and the cities and with all the problems that they have, and the exploitation of such labor in order for people like Carnegie, or depending on how you pronounce it, Rockefeller, and so many others to become, in the hundreds of $1 million millionaires in those days, which is basically 340 million here, half a trillion there, 280 billion here, in terms of today's dollars, right? So it's the nexus of all of those things, of a federal government that's completely willing to turn a blind eye. In many cases, so state governments, city government in New York and Tammany Hall turned a blind eye to all their abuses. So that's it in a nutshell for the week. That's a lot. That is a lot, right? I will talk more about the progressive era, the Gilded Age, and the excesses thereof in muckraking next week. But one other thing, because I'm actually over my normal time, is that you have a topic proposal that's due at the end of week 2. It's just part of one of the requirements that I'm kind of forced to do as part of teaching this course, so that you can get a sense of how to do research, from practical concerns. But since this is a survey course, I don't expect you to do a full amount of research. I took out 3 of the topics, left in 2, so that you'd have some sense of how you'd start, right? But it's a survey course. I don't see the point of you doing, or trying to do some semblance of a research paper when you're trying to just get the material and just basically understand it. So what I would say is that just pick a topic anywhere. You have full range. Pick any topic that is of interest to you of U.S. history between 1865 and say 2022. Now, if I get too many that deal with COVID, I'm probably going to tell you pick yellow fever, pick the Spanish flu, pick something, but don't pick COVID because there's I'm reading stuff on COVID every day whether I want to or not. So pick something. But other than that, I'm not putting any restrictions on anyone. So okay, that's it. That's due on Sunday. So anyway, other than that, not Sunday, next Tuesday. Sorry about that. Next Tuesday. Next Tuesday, May the 31st. So anyway, thank you all. Let's all have a good week.